So, as I said, today we'll cover the fundamentals of validation, and this is an introduction into validation and what validation entails. So, of course, this is a partnership with the Bio Network, and which ultimately supports the pharmaceutical industry. Of course, as you guys have taken these courses, and if you've taken this course or BioWorks, the Bio Network platform offers a variety of courses, and even provides customized training for companies in North Carolina. So we have this validation course, which has been developed. We also have our BioWorks course. And then we have other things you can take as well. If you want to go into bioprocessing, quality control, compliance, analytical chemistry, and even microbiology. So that's a brief overview on Bio Network. So the course objectives for this lecture is we'll define validation as applicable to the manufacturing process of pharmaceuticals. We'll present factors that led to FDA's validation concept. We'll discuss the regulatory basis for drug validation requirements. We'll review other regulatory industry initiatives such as UDRLEX or ICH. We'll explain why, what, when, and how validations are performed. We'll review the FDA guidance for industry for process validation, and then we'll go over the structure of a validation program, such as the documents and risk-based approach. So overall, the class format, our approach is casual. If you have any questions, this is an online course, but don't hesitate to email me or text me, and I'll respond as soon as possible. Participate. Just make sure to have fun and just try to participate as much as you can by interacting with me. So, what is validation? That is what we're going to cover today. So when we complete this section, you'll be able to describe validation from a regulatory perspective. You'll explain the purpose of CFR 210 and 211, and you'll be able to define the following phrases: documented evidence, high degree of assurance, and consistently produced. And then we'll also discuss the industries that are impacted. So, how did validation get started? So validation was first proposed by two FDA officials in the mid-1970s to improve the quality of pharmaceuticals. And as validation was first proposed in the 1970s, of course, had to continuously evolve, but the concept was officially introduced to regulations in 1978. So we're going from the mid-1970s to 78, and now even into now, validation is continuously evolving. New policies and procedures are constantly being adapted. So it's just a constant evolving theme around validation. But as we will go through the why and how and what, the basic fundamentals and the basic whys or reasons why we validate pretty much stays the same. It's just how you do it sometimes, or has changed over time. So according to 21 CFR 210 and 211, validation requires documented evidence that provides a high degree of assurance that a specific process will consistently produce a product meeting its predetermined specifications and quality attributes. So what does this mean? Generally, a process or a piece of equipment needs to be validated because we want to ensure that that equipment or the process we're doing can be reproducible, as in we want to be able to ensure that batch to batch, equipment use to equipment use, will be getting consistent results, because the products we make heavily depends on us being able to produce it on a consistent manner with very, 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 very zero to none changes in how we do it, because any small change can lead to the altercation of how a drug is intended to be used. So you want to be able to make sure that the product you put out is made consistent across batches, no matter when you made it. You want to be able to prove that you can consistently produce that. So that's what validation ultimately proves, is that you can consistently make a product without minimal changes. So The first concept of validation is that you have documented evidence. So documented evidence means written proof exists. If you've taken my bioworks course before, I've preached if it isn't written, it didn't happen. The pharmaceutical industry is a heavily regulated industry, and um, if you don't document what you did, ultimately it didn't happen because the only way that an auditor has proof of what you did is by going through your documentation and then be able to see what you did for a particular batch. So if it isn't written, it didn't happen. Um, Documented evidence also shows that you conducted the appropriate tests, inspections, and have the data to support the results. So within any validation program, you have acceptance criteria and you have testing you have to do, and you have to meet those certain test criteria, and you have to be able to document whether you met that or not. If you met it, great. If not, you have to investigate and figure out what happened and retest to make sure that you ultimately meet your goals. And then lastly, what types of documented evidence are used to support CGMP manufacturing? So um, documented evidence, if you're validating, you more likely your documented evidence is your protocols. If you're manufacturing, more your documented evidence is your batch records. So it just depends on what you're doing as far as manufacturing. But most validation activities are documented or governed by a protocol. And we'll get into more details on what a protocol consists of in the validation. So, second, validation provides a high degree of assurance. So, a high degree of assurance means that we have a high level of confidence that the process will work based on developmental data and other controls procedures put in place prior to commercial production. So if you have a process that you're trying to validate and you try to get to the point where you get to your validation, you have to prove and develop SOPs. You have to prove and develop your testing procedures. You have to go through pre-validation activities. So there's a bunch of steps that leads into you going into being able to validate and ultimately producing on a day-to-day basis. So as you're going through the steps, you're getting that assurance that, hey, we have a high level of confidence that the process will work because you're passing those stage gates to get to the point where you can validate and ultimately produce on a day-to-day basis. So it just provides an extra level of assurance and data showing that you can produce at a high level. So again, going along with a high degree of assurance, when the process input parameters that are being monitored and controlled are in acceptable range, the process will only produce a conforming product. So as I stated earlier, you have process parameters that have to be met. And as you go through your validation process, you want to monitor and make sure that any acceptance criteria or process parameters that you have in place, let's say you monitor the pH and it needs to be within a certain range, or connectivity, or you're doing QC testing and you're testing for endotoxin or anything that you need to monitor for the process. You want to make sure that you consistently monitor and show that you are steady control by being within your acceptance criteria. So that also ultimately leads to a high degree of assurance that you're going to be able to produce a consistent and high performing batch on a consistent basis. And lastly, validation ultimately wants to prove that you can consistently produce. So consistently produce means it is manufactured the same time after time. The process output satisfies the predetermined specification. So ultimately, you want to have consistency between runs. As I said earlier, batch to batch, whether you made the batch in January or you made the batch in March or you made a batch 2 years from now, there needs to be consistency, because that proves that our drug is meeting the specifications and it's the same. You don't want to have any differences in your batches, because you don't want to have any potential differences in how the drug is produced, because what we say we're going to make, we want to make sure that the patient gets that, because if there's any differences, ultimately the patient might not be getting the best type of drug, or getting a high degree of accuracy for the drug. So you want to be able to make sure you have that consistency between runs, because you want to make sure the patients, no matter if it's patient number 2 to patient number 50, they need to be able to have the consistency of that drug. So that's what validation also gives you. Also, you want long-term process monitoring to trend consistency. So another aspect in manufacturing is you want to do trend reports and monitor your different acceptance criteria to make sure that over time they're still all within range. You don't want to have any inconsistencies, but you have to monitor that. And if you have any inconsistencies, you need to be able to fix the issue so that it doesn't become a problem down the road. So that's another thing that validation ultimately proves or gives you, is long-term process monitoring.